Okay, today it's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers. We have Susan Lynn. She is the cataloging and metadata librarian at Georgia State University. We also have Guy Frost, who is the University Associate Professor of Library Science and Catalog Librarian at Valdosta State University.
Morning, everyone. This is Susan. I guess it's time for me to talk. I'm so glad to be with you all today. And Dustin, if you can transfer control to me. There might be a bit of a delay as we switch over. Okay. And I'm sharing my desktop with you all. In a moment, you should see. I hope you're seeing my slides now. And if you'll bear with me for just a moment, I would like to do a couple of quick polls with you. And it's going to take me just a moment to set that up.
While she's working on that, good morning all.
Can you see the poll yet?
No. Yes.
Okay, great. Let's, if everyone would take a moment to respond to this poll. I hope you're seeing the actual poll, but if you're not, the questions are up on this slide. Now, today's presentation is geared towards non-catalogers, so Guy and I will try very hard to not talk in mark tags. Of course, everyone is welcome, so if there are catalogers in the audience, we're very glad to see you all, or see, figuratively speaking, you all too. When we do use cataloging jargon, we will try to explain that. If we do use a term that you're unfamiliar with, please feel free to drop a note in the chat. We are going to share our slides after this presentation, so we do have some links in there. Don't feel like you have to write everything down. We will be sharing the slides. And I would encourage everyone to submit your questions in the chat anytime you have a question come up. Guy and I are going to be monitoring the chat sort of for each other while the other one's talking, and we'll try to handle questions in real time as best we can. We'll also have a couple of short Q&A periods, once after my portion and then after Guy's portion. So let me take a quick look at the results of this poll as they're coming in. We do have some catalogers here. Hello. We have, it looks like the most respondents so far have responded. I do a little bit of everything. So lots of folks who are wearing many hats. We have some reference and some circ, ILL, a little bit from almost everything except maybe special collections. So a really nice variety. Glad to see so many different folks here. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. And I'm going to start the second one if I can remember how to do it. Okay, and here's the next poll. I'd like to get a sense, if you know, about your library's plans for implementing RDA. Maybe some of you have already implemented, maybe you are planning to implement. Maybe those of you who are attending today don't know. That's totally fine. Maybe you've never heard really much about RDA. That's fine too. That's what we hope to help with today. So I'm going to leave this poll open for a little while and just go on. So for anyone who's answering what is RDA to this poll, RDA is Resource Description and Access. And it's the new cataloging standard that is replacing AACR2. And you may have heard catalogers talking about it. RDA has not been without controversy. There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of debate. Many catalogers are still very much in the learning stages, and there are best practices for RDA very much still in flux and under debate in specialist communities like music and audiovisual cataloging. So if RDA is a cataloging thing, and you're not a cataloger, why do you need to know about it? Well, it's part of an evolution, or some might say a revolution, in library data. one of RDA's stated objectives is responsiveness to user needs. And I do have to say that catalogers have long held the principle that the convenience of the user should take precedence over the convenience of the cataloger. So we've always been trying to focus on user needs. However, I think that RDA and many other developments that are happening concurrently offer new ways to fulfill these long-held principles. So we're not going to see much of RDA's promise realized in the current MARC and ILS environment, though. RDA does put us in a better position for our data to interact in the web environment, and there are a lot of potential benefits to users in terms of displays, searching, navigating, and ultimately finding the resources and information of interest to them. For you who are not catalogers, RDA may not have as noticeable an effect on your daily workflow right now as it may be for catalogers, but you still may notice some changes in the current environment and more substantive changes becoming apparent as systems and data formats continue to develop. So because RDA heavily emphasizes relationships, I like to introduce it with a little personal ad. Relationships are probably the most transformative aspect of RDA. So in my personal ad, we see that RDA is kind of the new kid on the block in terms of cataloging standards. It was published in 2010, and at the moment it's coming into wider use in the U.S. community. However, it is firmly grounded in the Anglo-American cataloging tradition and in internationally accepted principles such as the International Statement of Cataloging Principles, as well as the FRBR, Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records, conceptual model. Much of RDA structures and terminology comes straight from FRBR. And further is kind of out of scope for today's discussion, but there are some resources in our resource list if you're interested. RDA is also very consciously international, not Anglo-American centric, as AACR2 was. For example, the German library community has been very active in RDA development and adoption, and they're now represented on the committee that is responsible for RDA. And several translations are also complete or in process, including Chinese, French, Spanish, and German. RDA is also intended to be very flexible and extensible to any type of resource, from traditional library materials like printed books to digital resources and emerging formats that may not be widely collected just yet. RDA is independent of any display standard or encoding standard, and by that I mean RDA should work with MARC, Dublin Core, any other metadata schema. But it's helping to drive changes and developments in these areas, even though it is not prescriptive or tied to any particular encoding or display standard. And so relationships, of course, are big, 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 big in RDA. And we've been concerned with relationships basically since the beginning of cataloging time, but RDA provides different ways to express the nature of relationships between resources and persons or organizations, and explicitly describing these relationships and roles will help users to make more dynamic connections from one thing to another. And Guy is going to talk a little bit more about relationships later on. Let's do a brief history of RDA. The RDA Toolkit was published in June of 2010. It is an online subscription product. It's not free, and its native format is online. There is a print version available, but the online version, if you can get the subscription, is preferable in many ways. In late 2010 and early 2011, the U.S. National Libraries conducted an official test of RDA in real-world conditions, and the result of that was they decided to implement, but with some conditions. And so there was a bit of a lag to allow all the parties to work on these conditions that the National Library set. And for Library of Congress, they decided their day one, which is the day that all their new cataloging was officially going to be RDA, would be March 31st, 2013. And so on April 1st, 2013, the world ended. No, not really. But in spring of 2013, there was a lot going on with conversion of authority files. And for the Library of Congress to distribute these, they could do a lot of that programmatically or in an automated way. Not every heading, of course, changed with RDA, but there were a lot of headings and authority records that needed to be updated. And so a lot of that happened in terms of distributing the records in spring of 2013. And depending on your local system and your local workflow, your library is probably still trying to do some mop-up with that. You may have done a lot of those changes already, but are still doing some manual mop-up. And the latest news is that the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, or the PCC, determined that their last day for AACR2 bibliographic records would be December 31, 2014. Now, if you're not a PCC library, which probably most of us in this audience are probably not PCC libraries, you can continue to create AACR2 bibliographic records, and even PCC libraries can do that if they so choose. However, they cannot code them as PCC records after December 31st of this year. So unlike the changeover from AACR1 to AACR2 in, I believe, 1981, there really isn't an implementation mandate or deadline for all U.S. libraries. But you are probably already seeing the effects of RDA in your catalogs. And access points, which is going to be Guy's major topic, have in many cases changed or are changing to RDA forms, and that needs to happen throughout local catalogs because we all want to be in step with our authorities. And if your library participates in any shared cataloging, if you get vendor records, if you get records from OCLC, you're seeing RDA records. And most libraries are accepting RDA copy from various sources, even if we may not be creating RDA records in-house. Let's look a little bit at how RDA might be affecting users, some things that public services staff and librarians and users might be noticing today. Now, most of these changes that I'm talking about here are going to be a little bit superficial, but they are intended to improve user-friendliness of data. And this is not intended to be an exhaustive list of changes with RDA. I've just tried to select a few that might be more noticeable. First of all, Latin abbreviations are not used in RDA records. So here's an example of when we did not have any information about the place of publication, publisher, or date of publication. Under AACR2, we would use these very cryptic Latin abbreviations. Under RDA, we can use these rather long phrases in English or whatever language of cataloging that your institution uses to say that we don't know or we couldn't identify where this was published, etc. However, that's still not tremendously helpful to the user, so many catalogers prefer to make their best reasonable guess or estimate to supply these elements and provide something in brackets to show that we didn't actually take this from the resource, but provide some helpful information instead of those longish phrases. But Latin is gone. And other abbreviations that we may have become accustomed to under AACR2 are now spelled out in RDA. It was, I think I ran into the misconception sometimes among catalogers when we were first hearing about RDA that all abbreviations were always spelled out, and that's not necessarily the case. So for some fields and elements, it will depend on how something appears on the resource. In my last example of the fourth edition, it will be dependent on how the publishers present that information. So the cataloger should take exactly what they see on the resource to give that edition statement. Inaccuracies that appear on a resource are also treated a little bit differently in RDA. And this might affect browses or left-anchored searches depending on how these work in your system. The main thing is that under RDA, we would not use the Latin notation thick or the abbreviation IE anymore to indicate an inaccuracy found on the resource. So the cataloger would transcribe, for example, this title. They would transcribe the misspelling of Caesar exactly as they saw it on the resource, but then they're probably also going to add a variant title for the correct spelling, because the incorrect spelling, it tells you that, hey, this was wrong on there, but the correct spelling is probably going to be more helpful. But the cataloger is not fiddling quite as much with what we see on the resource when we're transcribing directly from the resource. Now I'm going to show you a few more changes that are getting a little bit more substantive. So here's a bit of cataloger jargon, the rule of three. The rule of three is sort of an informal term for an AACR2 rule that said if you have more than 3 of any person or organization that perform the same role or function, like 5 editors or 17 authors, that would be, pretty unusual, but it does happen. But if you have more than 3, the cataloger would only provide the first one listed, and then they would use et al., and they would only give an access point for that very first name. Under RDA, the basic instruction is to give all the names as they appear on the resource, and also give access points for any or all of those names. So that has the potential to provide greater access to, that second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and on person. And so maybe there's, out of 17 authors, maybe there's one that's down on the list, but that's important to your institution, and so go ahead and give an access point for that person. Now sometimes if you have a lot of names, it may not make sense to include all of them. So RDA does give you the option to summarize what you've omitted, as I've shown here, but instead of using et al., we use a short statement in English or whatever language that we're cataloging in that tells what we took out. Catalogers usually prefer to give more information rather than less, so I think this change is a popular one among catalogers to transcribe more names instead of cutting it short after 3. A little bit about dates in RDA. RDA clearly distinguishes between different types of dates: publication, distribution, manufacture, and copyright. And the change there is that under AACR2, the copyright date was often substituted for the publication date. And so here's an example of how that might look different. You may be wondering why you're seeing the same exact year twice in a particular record, and that's why, because the publication date and the copyright date are really a different concept, and RDA clearly distinguishes that. And I'm going to throw a little bit more cataloging jargon at you now. The GMD, don't worry about that just yet. The GMD is replaced by 3 new elements: content, media, and carrier. And so I'm sure you're probably asking, what is a GMD? GMD stands for General Material Designation, and even if you've never heard of that term, GMD, before, you've probably seen these a million times in your catalogs. It's that term in square brackets that appears right next to a title in your results list or in a record that sort of gives you an early warning of what that resource is, generally for non-print formats. And so here's some examples of the 3 new elements under RDA instructions that replace that GMD. And you can see that the RDA elements, two-dimensional moving image, video disk, text, unmediated volume, those terms are not terribly user-friendly. The real usefulness of these terms is not necessarily to be displayed to the public. They're really designed to be used under the hood, maybe to generate icons, limiting or faceting in your catalog. And so there's still some things that need to be worked out, but in general, the approach of RDA with separating those three elements of content, media, and carrier gives you more flexibility to represent resources such as playaways, which, you know, are they an electronic resource? Are they a sound recording? I've seen long, drawn-out, heated debates about what GMD, you know, to use on playaways, because you could only use one under the AACR2 rules, and it was very difficult for catalogers to often represent all the aspects of these resources that, you know, maybe included 2 or 3 different kinds of content or 2 or 3 carriers. So the content media carrier approach is a little bit more flexible. And here's a few more examples of the change to the GMD to content media carrier fields. So we've looked at a lot of elements in isolation. I'm just going to show you a few more complete records so that you can see how this sort of starts to work together a little bit. Now, some of these elements that I'm highlighting here, like the word composer next to Ethan F. Wickman in this example, I haven't really talked about that yet, and Guy is going to tell us a little bit more about these elements. But you can see some examples here. This one is from University of North Texas. Here's an example from worldcat.org showing the phrases of place of publication not identified. An example from University of Georgia Libraries that shows that the cataloger has given an access point for 4 people who perform the same function. They've also listed all the names in the next to the title there at the top. They've listed all the names that were involved in this resource, which gives a lot better access to deeper down in that list of people who are involved. And I wanted to show you this example from Reed College because they have elected, or at least at the time I took this screenshot, they are displaying in their public views the content, media, and carrier fields. So that is fairly unusual from what I've seen. Most libraries are not displaying those, but that's definitely a decision that each library can make with your system, controlling your displays. RDA doesn't tell you you have to display this or that. It just tells you what to record. So depending on what your library wants to do, you may or may not want to display these. But for my library in particular, we are actually suppressing these from view, but we leave them in the record because we want them to be used when systems are ready to use those. We want them to use those under the hood. So a couple of things to think about based on the changes that I've shown you so far. The big one for a lot of libraries is the loss of the GMD. And you want to think carefully about whether that's significant to your system or your users. A lot of catalogers and users find that it's a very helpful early warning to patrons. And so some libraries have decided to add GMDs into RDA records, at least until systems are better able to use those new content, media, and carrier fields. If you do decide to do that, please do that only in your local copy of the record, not in a shared database master record copy. And there are several other new fields that have been developed to accommodate new or changed RDA elements. And so you may want to think about whether you want to display or not any of those new fields. You may wish to suppress some or all of these from the public view, but I never recommend deleting fields, even if they can't be fully used yet, because there could be applications further on down the road as systems continue to develop for indexing, faceting, or limiting, even if you're not displaying this data to the user. And the long-time assumption that I've had has been that RDA records and data would live alongside records created under different standards, and that we'd have hybrid catalogs, because we've kind of always had hybrid catalogs. We didn't change everything to AACR2 from AACR1. So we've always had sort of this mix of different standards in our catalog. But we've also realized that a lot of the new elements in RDA are not going to be as useful unless they're added to legacy records retrospectively as much as possible. I don't think it's really feasible or realistic for most of us with our current technology and staffing to truly convert an entire database into full compliance with RDA, and I don't think it would even be desirable necessarily. But it's possible and likely that many of us will make selected automated changes across our entire catalog. For example, I think the most helpful thing to add retrospectively would be those content, media, and carrier fields. And OCLC is also making some automated programmatic changes to WorldCat retrospectively. And this link here will tell you a little bit more about that. Thinking about the future, just have a few thoughts about that. I've alluded to this already, but the transition to RDA is still very much ongoing with our systems and our vendors. Before LC decided to implement RDA, many vendors were not doing a whole lot of RDA-related development, aside from making sure their system could accept the newly created MARC field. But now that RDA is real for LC, for the Library of Congress, and other libraries are implementing along with Library of Congress or planning to do so very soon, we're seeing a little bit more activity in this area, working with indexing and displays to accommodate RDA data. So you really want to talk to your system vendor about this. There's many decisions that need to be made locally in terms of display and indexing. And although MARC has been adjusted quite a bit to accommodate RDA data, it has become abundantly clear that MARC is not extensible or shareable enough to work well in the linked data environment that we're moving towards. And so I'm not sure if you've heard of BibFrame or the Bibliographic Framework Transition Initiative. The short answer is that is an initiative to develop a replacement for MARC, spearheaded by the Library of Congress. It's out of scope for today, but there are a couple of links here if you want to find out about BibFrame. It is still very much in the development stages, but there are some early experimenters in libraries who have been working with it, as well as the folks at LC who are driving this. So I won't say a whole lot about this right now, but I've briefly mentioned linked data, the linked data semantic web environment. RDA is kind of a part of this. It's definitely not the only piece of the puzzle, but the goal is to make library data more machine operable and shareable in the larger web environment. And there's some things that RDA does to help move us in that direction, defining discrete elements, decreasing emphasis on free text strings, as well as the RDA vocabularies and element sets published in the RDA registry as linked open data. So the whole idea that RDA is a part of is getting our library data, which is very rich in many cases, more into the user's natural flow of information. Others want to use and repurpose it, and we also want to integrate others' data into our resources. But in the MARC environment, this is difficult to do. So RDA is just a part of the effort to do this. And I'm going to stop here before turning over to Guy and see if there are any questions.
If you have any questions, you can use the raise hand icon above the chat window in the participants window, and I will keep a lookout. If only if you have an active microphone and would like to ask a question out loud. Otherwise, you can put it in the chat window.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. If you do have questions later on, of course, send them in the chat. We're also going to post, oh, here's a question. For libraries who will not use RDA, will they be able to use BibFrame? That's an excellent question. My feeling right now, although it's kind of early, is that BibFrame will have to be able to accommodate data and content that's created under various standards, including RDA. So although RDA is kind of the impetus for creating BibFrame, it will definitely have to accommodate other standards than RDA. Guy, would you agree with that? Guy is muted right now, so I'm really putting him on the spot right now. But yes, BibFrame, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I agree that with that statement because our libraries now exist with multiple standards, pre-AACR2, AACR1, AACR2, as well as RDA. So whatever carrier we have for our bibliographic data would have to be able to accommodate all of those. So I don't see any problem with BibFrame using any other standards that you've got in your library, whether you adopt RDA or not.
And I think that's consciously part of the BibFrame development. It has to be. So, but that's right. A really excellent question. Any other questions at this point? I don't want to eat into Guy's time too much, so maybe we can go ahead and pass control over to Guy.
Okay, I'll do that.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, and I'm going to keep an eye on the chat while Guy is talking.
Okay, Guy, you're good to go.
All right, can everybody see that? All right, let me just move out of this. Good. I get a yes from Susan. Okay. So what are access points? We were talking, Susan did an excellent job of actually pointing all those out. But with these access points, we're really talking about fielded search points, such as title searches or author searches and subject searches. Under RDA, all of these will have some kind of impact. And a lot of it, particularly with the subject headings, that has yet to be developed. But with the authors and the titles, there's actually a lot of changes, and we're going to talk about some of those. So why are we having these changes? As Susan pointed out, resources to be discovered, they have changed. Internet resources, ebooks, streaming video, the way that we described all those resources using the GMD, that is more useful if you think about using it as using your smartphone, that it becomes more limiting. The limits would be much easier to do if you actually have some more standardization and simplification and the removal of all the different variants like the Latin abbreviations and all that stuff. So there's a lot of desire for the Google box. They want a single search box. But you're not going to find all your resources but just by the Google box search, because you'll get a lot of false hits. So there has to be other mechanisms that allow you to sort this information or index it better or even limit it better. And those are some of the things that RDA brings with it, as well as changes in MARC, and we're going to talk about all of it in just a second. So what has been changed? The basic description that Susan talked about, that what you see is what you get. We're moving away from codes, we're moving away from abbreviations and punctuation and numerals, and really putting in exactly what you see. This is supported by the new Paris Principles, the Statement of International Cataloging Principles, that has been translated now into over 27 languages, and it's the principle of representation. The resource you have in your hand should be reflected in the bibliographic record as you see it, and access points are a big part of that, and I'm going to talk more about that as well. So, old terminology that we were familiar with from library school, such as main entry and chief source and authors, those have kind of gone by the wayside because now you have authorized access points. And for chief source, we have preferred source. And for authors, we have creators. So you think about a person that is an architect. He is not necessarily an author, or an artist such as Michelangelo. He is a creator, not just an author. So this expands that definition considerably. The changes came also in phases, and Susan talked a little bit about this. The Library of Congress authority file had a washing, and with that, each name authority file, such as authors and corporate bodies, authors and titles, and some of the others, these were touched somehow, all of them. And some of them were marked as compliant. So we saw little difference at all. Anything that could be manually changed could be, and anything that was marked as incompatible, in other words, they were not RDA compliant, was also done so. So they were done in phases. Phase 1 was marking everything incompatible, and Phase 2 was automating. For Phase 1, there was little impact in libraries at all. It was something for NACO libraries to have to deal with, a way for us to identify those things that really needed human intervention. But the Phase 2 actually did see a lot of impact with the libraries, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those. And as Susan mentioned, a lot of work remains because of all these changes that happened. To give you a better idea of what these changes are, there were 436,943 records changed in Phase 1. So these were ones marked incompatible with RDA. That means that's a lot of manpower that needs to be distributed amongst all of the NACO libraries. In Phase 2, there were a little over 400,000. So that's still a lot that libraries would have to absorb. And what the Library of Congress did is they tackled 30,000 records per day until it was done. And that caused a huge backlog within libraries who have contracted out with, say, Marchive to receive authority records. And so all of that had to be worked through, and some libraries are still doing it because it is so massive. Okay, so here are some of the changes. Susan mentioned some of them, but here are some more. We wanted to eliminate abbreviations, not just in the descriptive part, but also in the access points. So department was changed to department. Georgia Department of Agriculture is an example. Now, because there aren't any authority records for all of these, it resulted in a split file. In other words, you still have records for Georgia DEPT in your catalog because there was no authority file, say, for another office within the Department of Agriculture. So that was a big change. OT and NT changed to Old Testament and New Testament, respectively. Simplification, removing the OT or NT from these titles because it was unnecessary. Clarity, changes to like CA for period, circa, changed to approximately. And here's an example where Thomas Tallis, he worked approximately 1505 to 1585 because we don't know his birth or death dates. There's also the flourish changed to active. Sunzi, active 6th century to BC. B and D actually changes. The change here to an N dash and removing the B and D was very important because, one, it actually provided better indexing in results lists. They, like, for example, the Cleary-Thomas example I have, it put all the people with the same name in 1949 birth date together in one results list. So it makes it easier for selecting what you want from the resources. And the same thing with Brown Alexander example. Having the death date removed allow for proper indexing in these results lists. There was also less ambiguity. So these are more clarity changes. In the old AACR2 version, in an author uniform title, if you notice in this fantasies, clarinet, and strings is not very specific. But in the new RDA version, you have now violins, too, viola, and cello. And some people have actually simplified this one step further and removed the two, because the plural would tell you sometimes, like if you had a quartet and there was only 4 instruments, the two is sort of redundant. So it's very clear and very specific. More changes. Common uses. So violoncello changed to cello, such as sonatos, cello and continuo, or the changing of the spelling of Quran. These are more changes that occurred for clarity and for common usage, for what people are typically going to look for. Undifferentiated names. These are names shared by many people, such as John and the James Jones, if you will. So if you've got 2 authors and they actually have the exact same name, you want to differentiate them. So you don't necessarily have the birth date or the death date for either one, but there are ways for you to make a distinction between one or the other. Before, under AACR2, you just put John Doe as a name, so it wasn't very specific. But as we move toward the linked data, you'll see why this is more important, and I talk about that in a few minutes. But there is work being done by NACO libraries to differentiate all these undifferentiated names. And if you want to actually keep track of those, you can look at the list, sign up for the list, the personal names list, and that will tell you what has been changed, created, or updated to help remove all these undifferentiated names. Again, the principle of representation. How authors represent themselves on their publications. It becomes more and more important now. So junior or senior, they're now included regardless. Before, you only had to put junior in an author's name if you needed to differentiate between him and someone else. But now, to break that conflict, you don't need to do it. You could just automatically put it in. So that's the big difference. Fictitious characters are now considered authors. This is another big change. So if you've got a book that says it's written by Miss Piggy, then you put Miss Piggy as the author. So that's something that a lot of people are having difficulty wrapping their head around. But now we also enter the era of relationships and linked data, and Susan talked about that a little bit, and her examples were pretty awesome, I thought. It's very good representations of what we're trying to talk about. Showing relationships between entities associated with a resource does come to the forefront of access points. And I've shown you, like when you saw Miss Piggy, you saw that after her name, author was actually put in there. This helps you distinguish between people that are authors, writers of introductions, editors. It distinguishes what their role to the resource is. And that is something that is more important now than ever. So relationships between 2 distinct resources, such as sequels and prequels. I'm going to show you some examples of what I'm talking about there. But also the relationships between entities within the resource itself, such as authors and photographers and so forth. So distinct resources such as serials. Serials have always shown these relationships to other resources, such as title changes or supplements. So with serials and showing relationship, there's little difference. And here's an example. What you have here is you have a public note as well as access points. So you have the title is the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, but in the public note, formed by the union of, that is your relationship. It's being very specific, telling you what it is. And then as an access point, even though this repeated, Atlanta Journal with Atlanta, Georgia, 1889 is an access point, a title search, as well as the one just below that. So there are ways of showing what these relationships are, both as a general public note as well as access point. Distinct resources and non-serials. So this is how it's really been expanded for resources that are non-serial. You're using a lot of the same fields, but you're actually also linking resources together. So in this case, you have a book, and it says Follow-Up Review, Animal Protection Program, Department of Agriculture. So if you look at that, there are some differences between the supplement. The supplement has Performance Audit, Department of Agriculture, Animal Protection Program. You can add variant titles for both of those, beginning with Animal Protection Program for the first one, or the supplement you can begin with Department of Agriculture. And those typically would link these two together, but because these titles are different, these subtitles are different, then their choice of access points needs to be different. And you can do that. You're actually putting it in a subfield, and I'm going to show you some subfields in a few minutes. But in this particular case, the subfield I has the supplement 2. And this comes directly from RDA. There's appendices in RDA that gives you lists of what the verbiage should be. It is not prescriptive, but it is actually at least a guide and very helpful and useful. So here's another example of a non-serial relationship that's different. Before, you have an author. We're showing you the relationship by adding author to the author's name. You have the title, Clan of the Cave Bear. But she also wrote a sequel to this. Before, you can just put Valley of the Horses or something. But now, you actually put in a subfield I stating that it is a sequel. You're actually being very specific and explicitly stating what the relationship is between the book you have in your hand and another resource. So this is a big change for all non-serials. Other examples could be abridgment of a work, or an adaptation of a work, or other things, libretto based on work, free translation of a work, or just a translation of a work. So you can see there's all kinds of, the possibilities are really endless. So future developments with these relationships, what all this really means is that because those are linking fields, when someone is searching, say, for Tolkien and The Hobbit, they would get an entry, but they would also get it perhaps broken down by books, by videos, and by audio resources. And each one of those, too, are broken down by adaptations, or someone perhaps has illustrated The Hobbit, or you might have, for videos, you have DVDs, you have streaming video, you have VHS. There's all kinds of possibilities, and those linking fields pull them all together, but showing those relationships, such as the one I have here, motion picture screenplay based on work, it actually gives you what the original resource is and what relationships there are out there of other resources, whether they are standalone physical items in your library versus items that are on the web. And that is the whole point, I think, of RDA and the changes with BibFrame, is that we're moving into an environment that allows a better description of all these resources and linkages to those resources, so that you're not confined to one area in the building. We have, was it Library Without Walls? Is that what it is? So we also have related resources. You see also SMOG, it's another resource that that is related to the Hobbit, but it's different. So let's talk a little more about this linked data, this moving out of the walls, out of the building. What is going to happen is that there are identifiers associated with each one of these. And a lot of these we know we have library bib IDs in our catalog, and we have authority file numbers. And a lot of those now are going to be placed within the bib record. So that, let's say, something happens with Anne Rice and her name changes, that if you actually have a link to the resource, such as an authority record for Anne Rice, it would automatically change. This is different. Currently, in our library catalogs, all of these authority files are located in our ILS system. But when we move out to linked data, when we move out into the cloud, those links are going to be to somewhere else. The picture I have of Anne Rice right here is a good example. This would be a link to, say, a publisher's website where they have provided the link, and you use a file number, a URL or a URI, something that's permanent, that links to that, so that it's not housed in your library catalog, but housed elsewhere. Authority files are going to be done the same way, whereas, like I said, right now it's in your catalog, it's going to be elsewhere. There are European catalogs now, European libraries, that are already doing this. So that the idea and the technology is there. It's just we need to get the U.S. on board, and many other countries also that are still looking at this. Here's another example of the changes that are coming with linked data. So in this particular case, we have Joan Bailey. She was our former president's wife. She just passed away. But if you look at these labels, associated country, the location, the birth date, and the death date, field of activity will be a very important one, as well as affiliation, because in the next generation system, our library catalogs will be able to sift and sort and these facets that are provided in authority records. This is something that's not been done before. So that if your patron comes up to the reference desk and they're looking for, say, all of the resources you have for, say, college president spouses that are part of Valdosta, you would be able to look at Valdosta State University or Valdosta, Georgia as a location, and then perhaps college president spouses, and then just pull up a whole list just out of that of whether, see, Valdosta State College, whether it's Valdosta State University, whether it's South Georgia Women's College, which is one of our predecessor names as well. So a lot of this is really going to enhance our discovery of resources. But there's a lot that needs to be done for that to happen. Here's just another example of where Valdosta State University changed its name. And you see also, example where it says predecessor, Valdosta State College. Predecessor is another relationship term that comes directly from RDA in one of the appendices. So RDA is going to be important for both. Faceted access points is another emerging part of library cataloging. So the question that a lot of people are beginning to ask is, are search strings we are so accustomed to being phased out, such as Library of Congress subject headings? Right now there are rules about when to use a geographic subdivision or a form subdivision and whatnot. Faceted headings eliminates all that. It's designed to be low-cost, non-expertise application of subject headings. It is based off of Library of Congress subject headings at this point because there's already a body of established authority records, and This is actually a collaboration between OCLC and the Library of Congress. So to give you, this is where I've actually had to digress and move into the MARC fields to explain this. So in our subject catalog, in the MARC view, an LCH subject heading looks like what I've given you. 650, the 0 means that it's Library of Congress subject heading. And then you have railroads, you have a geographic subject heading, Georgia, and also a form subject division, maps. When that actually gets moved into a fast heading, fast headings, you have a 650, you have a 7, which means that you're going to define in subfield 2 exactly what thesaurus or schema you're using for these terms. And then if you see the subfield 0, you have an OCLC number fast heading. So these are going to be your fields. In the next generation system, which may not be in that far distant future, we'll put just that number in, and we won't actually put the heading in. They will link out to the resource and display to the public what it is they're linking to. So that is a significant change that's on the horizon. But you can also see within this that each one of those facets, the railroads, the Georgia, and the map, gets their own separate field. And that makes it simplifying for a non-specialist to add. They just go into the FAST database, they look up the term they think is appropriate, and then they copy and paste it into this MARC record. So there are some strings that do exist, such as the 651 I have with Georgia Atlantic Coast. The difference is that well, for LCSH, we have Atlantic Coast, Georgia abbreviated. So this takes out the abbreviation that we want to move away from, making it much better for discovery. I see my formatting did not migrate. Okay, so with this, there's also expansions of indexes to help facilitate that. We've talked about some. We've talked about some that are in RDA, and we've talked about LCSH, but there are more that are on the horizon. One that was just approved this past February was the Library of Congress Medium Performance Thesaurus for Music, or the LCMPT. So this is another one where it's best shown using MARC. So in the past, you did an 048, which told you that there were, WC means it's clarinet, and the 04 means that there are 4 clarinets. And then you added a subject heading, woodwind quartets, clarinets 4. But that doesn't really tell you what you're looking at. Under RDA, you can still put the 040 now because it's not really tied to RDA. But the 382 is, because RDA tells you that you need to record this information. MARC is telling you how to record it. So now we have clarinet. There are 2 clarinets. This is your standard clarinet as defined by the thesaurus. There's also 1 alto clarinet, and there's 1 bass clarinet. And the subfield S says there's a total of 4 players, and the subfield 2, again, tells you what thesaurus that these terms are coming from. The 655, right below that, woodwind quartets, actually would be an LCGFT, which is the Library of Congress genre form thesaurus, or terms. So this is, again, a big difference, because now we can be very explicit about what these resources are. Just note that the FAST, LCMPT, LCGFT, and other thesaurus schemas that are not part of RDA, but they are intended to facilitate better discovery in the non-MARC environment. I've actually given you LC's display of this as it is shown right now. They are beginning to play with their own catalog to see how the data can be manipulated for public display. So this is an example above of what you would see. Clarinet 2, alto clarinet 1, bass clarinet 1. And the rest of it is, at this point, is suppressed from the public. The genre, woodwind quartets, does not exist yet in LCGFT. But beginning in November of this year, November, December, they are going to start looking at the 650 genre headings like woodwind quartets or sonatas, flute, and so forth, and establish them as the LCGFT and cancel the LCSH heading. So this is a rapid change that is coming. And how our libraries are going to deal with this is still an unknown. But we talked about other things besides the access points. We talked about filtering and limiting. And there are other ways of doing that as well. And specific fields have been created for this, as well as old fields have been expanded. So here we have digital file characteristics. Again, that's a relationship designated by the field itself. The field, that's what the field is actually means. And then you put exactly what it is. I have a text file that is a PDF. You have other example is an audio file, which is an MP3, and is 32 kilobytes per second. Each one of those is put into a separate subfield. And because of that, your users will be able to limit and sort and search on those specific subfields that makes a difference. Another one is font size. Large print books or big books and all that, for years under AACR2 and the old MARC practices, there was really never a spot for that. There was a fixed field code that a lot of people just didn't use it. Plus, our library systems never used it. And that was a major problem. So how do you distinguish between a large print book? Well, sometimes it was part of a series. That made it easy because it stood out. But sometimes that was not so evident. And some people put it in the GMD that Susan talked about. Some people put it in the physical description or the SMD, which says, you know, one book, 200 pages, large print in parentheses. But now you've actually got a specific field that has been repurposed or sort of say expanded, and a specific subfield that designates the print size, the font size. And so that allows you to, in the future, limit based on that because it is standardized as well. Those terms, again, come from RDA. Others sound like sound characteristics. You have for a DVD, you have digital, optical, surround, Dolby Digital, or this is actually a CD. But all of those fall into separate subfields. So here's an example I'm giving you with the 347. It's a new field, and it's the first one that I've given you up the top. It's a text file, but in the subfield B, you actually put what is the text file. Is it a Word document? Is it a PDF file? Those things users might want to know. And then those terms, again, are listed right in RDA, and then you just put those in there as subfield 2, RDA. So why are these changes? Again, it allows for indexing, sorting of results list. These fields are intended to be machine actionable. And that's where a lot of RDA and BibFrame is moving into a more dynamic environment for our users who are using a much more diverse collection of technologies to access information. So what does this mean for administrators? Well, catalogers need to be encouraged to move out of their comfort zone and begin looking at what changes RDA brings that enhance discovery. The best way to do that is to allow them to spend one day just sitting down and taking an AACR2 record in their catalog and converting it into RDA. This will allow them to learn it as well as get them into the toolkit and other resources out there to help explain what it is that's changed. Also, administrators need to support RDA training both online as well as face-to-face presentations and workshops. It's an investment on your part in your catalogers, and that is something that is very important, particularly as our discovery tools change. it's more important that all of the catalogers and technical services librarians do stay abreast of this. Many of these workshops, they're free online. COMO, for those who are actually in the Southeast or in Georgia, they have RDA programs pretty much every year now, and workshops, and they are worthwhile. We anticipate having one just on score cataloging, a 4-hour hands-on workshop pre-conference for COMO in October. So those are things that you can invest in with your catalogs. There's a ton of documentation, though, that the Library of Congress, the PCC, and the BIPCO, they have published online, and it's free access. That's very useful and very helpful. Another thing is to think about the linked data environment, how we're moving away from a centralized cataloging environment and discovery tool to a more cloud-based discovery layer. So recognizing that linked data is upon us, and consider joining the NACO program to create name authority files. If you think about, if you actually have a large genealogical collection in your library, it becomes more important that that information be put out there, not only for your local patrons, but for other patrons who just may have 1 or 2 books or resources that come their way. Because you're local, you actually have a body of information and context that a lot of the other people don't. So it allows you to put that historical information out there for others to enhance their discovery and find other resources, such as just your institution itself or a local office and that historical information. Catalogers also, they should begin looking for this with their system personnel. I know for a lot of people out there who wear more than one hat, that is you, but you just have to work with yourself. But catalogers should begin working with these people that can help automate changes within their local system that makes their AACR2 records or pre-AACR2 records a little more RDA compliant, such as the ones that Susan mentioned, adding the new 3XX field for the content media and carrier. LC has done a lot, not LC, but OCLC has done a lot of that in the system. Hybrid records are going to be a must for eventually you're going to have basically either 100% hybrid record or complete RDA records if you move into this direction. Selected resources, these are the ones that Susan actually mentioned in her presentation, and there are very helpful things there, so I would highly recommend you look at that. Here's our contact information, and feel free to contact us at any time, and we are more than happy to help. And that's all I have.